Leonardo was a genius, one of the few people in history who indisputably deserved, or to be more precise, earned that appellation. Yet it is also true that he was a mere mortal. The most obvious evidence that he was human rather than superhuman is the trail of projects he left unfinished. He repeatedly scribbled in notebook after notebook, tell me if I ever did a thing. Tell me if anything was ever made. By skirting the edge of fantasy with his flying machines and water projects and military devices, he envisioned what innovators would invent centuries later, and by refusing to churn out works that he had not perfected, he sealed his reputation as a genius rather than a master craftsman. He enjoyed the challenge of conception more than the chore of completion. And this is a passage taken from the book I studied in preparation for this episode, Leonardo da Vinci, the biography by the incredible biographer Walter Isaacson. And if you've heard of that biographer's name before, it's because he's written biographies on Benjamin Franklin, Einstein, Steve Jobs, and most recently Elon Musk. And when I first read this book on Leonardo years ago, I realized Walter Isaacson absolutely lives up to the hype. And the amazing thing is, if you see him in any interview, you can clearly tell that this man revered Leonardo da Vinci. And this is after writing a biography about many important people, so it really goes to show how high he places Leonardo da Vinci. But I did reread this book in preparation for this in order to better grasp the man whom I found truly fascinating for years. After all, this is the man who painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, whose engineering proposals would later be proven to be the very first war tank, helicopter, parachute, and telescope. Yes, he did beat Galileo. Who designed the very first top-down modern map, all whilst cataloguing anatomical drawings of the entire body, architecturally designing cities, churches, even professionally playing music, while of course designing and building new musical instruments himself. This man is incredible. This man wasn't making that trade-off that gives way to the saying, jack of all trades, master of none. He was the jack of all trades, master of all. He was truly the embodiment of the multi-disciplined Renaissance man. By the way, when I say I've been fascinated by Leonardo da Vinci for years, I really mean years, because my first ever encounter, slightly unusual, but first ever encounter of Leonardo da Vinci was actually in a video game I played growing up called Assassin's Creed 2. Yes, Leonardo da Vinci was a character in the game. He was a friend to the protagonist who roams Florence, Firenze, which is the place where the real Leonardo da Vinci honed his skills as a painter. So it's kind of an important backdrop for our artist, and I love the parallel there that was made. This character really stood out in the game. Like, really, even back then for me, growing up, I found him to be a very distinct character. He was the only character who seemed to be genuinely enjoying himself amidst the kind of very serious events that were going on throughout the games. And although in real life, Leonardo was at times dark and troubled, the makers of the game Assassin's Creed recognized that Leonardo's art came from his more generally positive and optimistic nature. And in the game, he's always smiley, joyous, but most importantly, eager to explore, excited to explore. He's always got drawings scattered everywhere, and he's always got these projects randomly starting up in the background whenever you go to see him in the game. So something was always going on with him, and, we'll later come to learn that this is actually a very accurate representation of Leonardo. But seriously, I've always been drawn to him immediately when I thought of this podcast, Icons. And for those who are new here, Icons is a podcast where I dive deep into the process and philosophy behind the works of great master artists. Leonardo came to mind when I first thought of this concept, but I felt I needed to be a few episodes in. I needed to arrive at episode 4 first to kind of have some notches in my belt before I could earn the right to cover such an incredible artist. So I hope you can tell I'm very excited to be doing this. Another book I'll reference, by the way, although sparingly, is Robert Greene's Mastery, which is a fantastic book, but he uses Leonardo's life as a kind of prominent character to highlight the process to obtain mastery over a craft. So, I'm going to pull some quotes from there, and actually I'll read something from there to extend on the passage that I opened with here. One time, even Michelangelo himself taunted Leonardo. You made a model of a horse you can never cast in bronze, and which you gave up to your shame, and the stupid people of Milan had faith in you. He had become used to such insults about his slowness at work, but in fact he regretted nothing from this experience. He had been able to test out his ideas on how to engineer large-scale projects. He would apply this knowledge elsewhere. Anyway, he didn't care so much about the finished product. It was the search and the process in creating something that always excited him. What if he devoted himself to mostly painting in order to make a good living? What if he had been more like the others, finished his works as fast as possible? He would have done well, but he would not have been Leonardo da Vinci. His life would have lacked the purpose that it had. And I'll now go back to the biographer Walter Isaacson, who we'll be mostly quoting from, who actually said in an interview that I watched about this very idea of Leonardo being distracted and meandering his way through his different projects. And it's why I wanted to start with this. He says, he wouldn't have gotten to the Mona Lisa. I think it took him being distracted by everything that nature offers to give him that fullness that made him such a genius. So the first lesson that Isaacson notes here is kind of get distracted, because Leonardo's willingness to pursue whatever shiny subject caught his eye made his mind richer and filled with more connections. And with that, let's begin with this episode of Icons, where we'll explore the wanderings and long tangents that took our genius artist, Leonardo da Vinci. And just as a kind of rundown, we will cover his first encounter with his skills as a child and the special apprenticeship that he had that laid the foundations for what was to come. We'll also cover his desire to mimic the wings of birds, the thousands of pages of notebook pages he left behind, a unique job application that he wrote, a piece of military equipment he created that won't be created again for hundreds of years, as well as his philosophy on how an artist can express the inner world outwardly, as well as a focus on two of his most important pieces of work he ever produced. And no, they won't be the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper. And as always, all the art I mentioned throughout the episode is listed in the description. So again, there's no need to frantically Google everything as you listen to this. Just sit back, enjoy, and learn about the life and world of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was born in the town of Vinci, which is why his name Da Vinci, which literally translates to of Vinci. But Leonardo was actually born out of marriage, out of wedlock. And this in the 1400s is a huge deal. But we'll actually learn how he ended up kind of benefiting in the grand scheme of things from the fact that he was born out of wedlock. Robert Greene in Mastery writes, his father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a notary and a staunch member of powerful bourgeoisie. But since Leonardo had been born out of wedlock, he'd been barred from attending university or practicing any noble professions. His schooling, therefore, was minimal, and so as a child, Leonardo was left mostly to himself. He liked most of all to wander through the olive groves around Vinci, or to follow a particular path that led to a much different part of the landscape. Dense forest of wild boar, waterfalls cascading over fast-moving streams, swans gliding through pools, strange wildflowers growing out of the side of cliffs. The intense variety of life in these forests enthralled him. And although Robert Greene writes that Leonardo was barred from university, he did have tutors. It's true that Leonardo had no formal education, but I just want to make a note that he did actually have these tutors, and you'll see why I'm noting that in a second. But later in his life, Leonardo would actually write in his notebooks, they will say that because I have no book learning, I cannot properly express what I desire to describe, but they do not know that my subjects require experience rather than the words of others. What a great line there by Leonardo to write to himself, first of all. I mean, very interesting. But, you know, he's kind of making a parallel here between the idea of formal education being that of learning from others in the words of others to the experiential version of learning, really delving deep into something firsthand and then learning from the first principles of that experience, something that makes Leonardo who he is and a curiosity he has carries through all those experiences. So we'll get into more of that later, but let me here go back to Robert Greene's Mastery, where he writes, one day, sneaking into his father's office, he grabbed some sheets of paper, a rather rare commodity in those days, but as a notary, his father had a large supply. He took these sheets on his walk into the forest, and sitting upon a rock, he began to sketch various sights around him. He kept returning day after day to do more of the same. Even when the weather was bad, he would sit under some kind of shelter and sketch. He had no teachers, no paintings to look at. He did everything by eye, with nature as the model. He noticed that in drawing things, he had to observe them much more closely and catch the details that made them come to life. An insight here is that I love that we can already learn something from Leonardo's childhood, that he was very observant, and we should be too. When gathering material, we should go straight to the source as he did. Don't look at another interpretation in order to get to something. Go straight to the source. And this simple ability to observe, to fight past our mind's tendency to simply label things, a tree, a flower. No, he would move past that and he would look at the details. This is a foundational pillar to Leonardo's work across all of the disciplines that he later encounters. I loved also that this kind of was a moment of destiny for Leonardo. Would he even be the same person if his father wasn't a notary, right? And didn't have all those sheets of paper. I love that this makes a point of how scarce paper was at the time, and it wasn't as easy to access, but the fact that his father had lots of paper gave him a new opportunity. I do wonder, would he have chosen to place his curiosity elsewhere if he didn't have access to paper, or would he have still found ways to kind of capture the details found in nature? Who knows? But I am reminded, of course, of Hayao Miyazaki, who we covered in episode 2, who too, would sit and observe nature. He would be able to pull details in such a way that it would look lifelike. And Leonardo was able to do this similarly as a child as well. Once he sketched a white iris, and in observing it so closely, he was struck by its peculiar shape. The iris begins as a seed, and then it proceeds through various stages, all of which he had drawn over the past few years. What makes this plant develop through its stages and culminate in this magnificent flower, so unlike any other? Perhaps it possesses a force that pushes it through these various transformations. He would wonder about the metamorphosis of flowers for years to come. And in this quote, we are now seeing the beginnings of Leonardo discovering new rabbit holes to burrow in, new pathways to possibly discover, which most people, considering that they've chosen a path or mission, might say, well, I'm here to learn to draw, and would see things like, how does a flower evolve, as simply a distraction to eliminate because it would get in the way of continuing to learn to draw. But for Leonardo, and this is really an insight for us, he would encourage himself to be more distracted. He would invite distractions, and so allow your curiosity to have its day, because as we will learn further with Leonardo, it does have other indirect influences into the development of his work. Even for me professionally, I am a product designer, but if it wasn't for my curiosity, I wouldn't have ever discovered my passion into diving into artists like Leonardo, and would have never resulted in me creating this podcast. But naturally, growing up with his tutors around him, they would rush to the conclusion that he generally struggled to concentrate. But his father, luckily, was very supportive and would actually encourage his curiosities and the fact that he was so interested in everything. So when Leonardo was 14, his father took all the drawings and paintings that Leonardo had done so far and took them to Andrea di Verrochio, who was a versatile artist and engineer who ran one of the best workshops in Florence. So he took those paintings to him, and Verrocchio said, he should come and work for him. In fact, Leonardo should make sure to foster his own skills because they were already showing so much potential. But eventually that managed to give Leonardo an apprenticeship, and something that would be so important and fundamental to the development of the version of Leonardo da Vinci that we know today. When Leonardo actually arrived, Verrocchio's workshop was already creating lots of different things. It was creating an ornate tomb for the Medici, who were kind of running Florence at the time, sculpting a bronze statue of Christ and the St. Thomas. They were designing banners for a pageant, creating Medici antiques, and generating Madonna paintings for merchants who wanted to display both their wealth and their piety. And this is almost an incredible place for Leonardo to be exposed to for one big reason, which is that it showed him different ideas of how to make his studies that he had done so far profitable. and the ways in which his work might be commissioned in the future. It's like that of the difference between someone who studies a subject at university and actually knowing what fields you can work in. That's an advantage that is huge, rather than just going in only knowing about the type of study that you're doing. It's actually about understanding where that study can be implemented and the value and the use it has in the world, and even just understanding the value for companies in those industries perhaps as well. For me, I was lucky enough to actually be exposed to both the media industry and the tech industry through internships and my first ever job before I even went to university. So I was lucky because they specifically gave me that unique ability to recognize when I felt what I was studying was and wasn't relevant to how I could provide value to those kind of two specific audiences that I was getting to know. So if you're an aspiring artist, or even just an artist who wants to understand another field, an insight here would be to place yourself at the feet of an environment that is directly serving an audience, be it through an internship or a job or anything that allows you to see the direct effect between the art and then the person consuming the art. And that's what Verrochio's workshop was for Leonardo. And whilst this value first mindset would give Leonardo the foundational approach of partnering and working with wealthy people or powerful people that he did throughout his career, who wanted to act as kind of patrons for the arts, this actually doesn't come to define the work itself, and that's something we'll later learn. It's a point of contention for Leonardo. But the topics of discussion in the workshop included that of math, autonomy, dissections, antiques, music, philosophy, it's all these great things. Giorgio Vasari is another biographer who wrote about Leonardo, who said Leonardo applied himself to the sciences and particularly geometry. Basically, this was an incredible place for Leonardo to discover and validate the pillars he would later build on his own, this kind of multi-disciplined career that we know of him to have today. But back to Walter Isaacson's biography, many of the workers lived and ate together in the quarters upstairs. The paintings and objects were not signed. They were not intended to be works of individual expression. The goal was to produce a constant flow of marketable art and artifacts rather than nurture creative geniuses yearning to find outlets for their originality. By the way, it's funny to me how Leonardo would not pick this part up. He adopts instead to have this significantly slower rate of production that I kind of hinted at in the passage in the introduction, and instead to see his work as a product of his intellectual exploration and curiosity, the very thing that Verrocchio wasn't necessarily, promoting. Verrocchio's studio was really, it was a studio, it was an agency almost, if you think about it in modern terms. But working at this studio was really important because Leonardo developed and learned 3 fundamental lessons that he would carry into his later work. Firstly, it's that geometry could be beautiful. After Cosimo de' Medici died, Verrocchio designed a marble and bronze slab for his tomb. And instead of religious imagery, the tomb slab featured geometrical patterns dominated by a circle inside a square. This is going to be something that we'll come back to with Leonardo as a mathematical and geometrical problem that he's fascinated by. There's a description here that says, inside the design, Verrocchio in his workshop carved carefully proportioned rectangles and half circles in colors that were based on harmonic ratios and the Pythagorean musical scale. There was harmony in proportions, Leonardo learned, and math was nature's brushstroke. I love that. And my first temptation here would be to say that I would never be able to understand maths to this extent, but a better mindset would be that of investor Charlie Mungers, who says, when he's asked, do you play piano, for example, he responds, I don't know, I haven't tried. This is probably the way I should think about maths as well. But when it comes to geometry being beautiful, this is something that is going to echo throughout Leonardo's work, something I will come back to. But the second lesson that he learned in the studio was something he learned whilst drawing draperies. And in fact, drapery studies was one of the learning exercises required for apprentices in the Verrocchio studio. According to Vasari, one of the biographers, Leonardo would make clay models of figures, draping them with soft pieces of cloth dipped in plata, and would then draw them patiently on thin sheets of cambric or linen in black and white with the point of a brush. And there's a incredible drawing that's shown in Walter Isaacson's book, which I highly recommend getting, by the way, because it it features all of the artwork contextualized within each story. But this drawing is beautiful. It's got these dark shades that give it this really naturalistic lighting that's just, it's almost unbelievable to see that it's a painting. It looks so real. And I think that idea of trying to capture the details of fabric crushed together at some points and stretched out at other points, but that imperfect light that hits it softly, all of that is captured so magnificently. And a side note is that there's much debate when discerning who actually did these drawings of draperies, which I think just goes to show the collaborative nature of Verrochio's studio, the fact that everyone was working on things together. Isaacson actually writes, "For Leonardo, the drapery studies helped foster one of the key components of his artistic genius, the ability to deploy light and shade in a way that would produce better illusions of the three-dimensional volume on a two-dimensional surface. They also helped him hone his ability to observe how light subtly caresses an object, causing a glistening of luster, a sharpened contrast on a fold, or a hint of reflecting glow creeping into the heart of a shadow." Leonardo actually noted to himself in his notebook, "The first intention of the painter is to make a flat surface of a body as if modeled and separated from this plane." And this separation of subject in the foreground from background is something to note when observing art yourself. When you go and look at a painting, particularly a busy composition by a master painter, there are some elements that sit in the foreground and some elements that sit in the background. And you should pay close notice to how this happens, because it's recognizing the details of this that allows artists to recreate it, but which Leonardo believes is the first thing a painter should learn to be able to do. So it's a really fundamental skill to be able to say, here are some things in the foreground and here are some things in the background. And I can make that discernment for the person paying attention. It's an art form that I think even exists in camera work, in film. You know, a cinematographer's job a lot of the times is about having that intentional effort to convey that some things are more important than others. That's why they sit in the foreground and some sit in the background, to leave those very important objects and subjects in the foreground and allow those less important details to fall into the background, to kind of blur themselves out. Blurring, of course, is one of the techniques, that shallow depth of field in camera work. But do examine this in paintings as well. And I think to just really take that idea home, I would even say that in our own lives, we should learn to cultivate the ability to discern what should sit in the foreground and what remains in the background in our lives and the things that we decide to do. And I think of a saying my grandma often says, which is that there are very few things we can do well. So do those few well. And I think in order to do that, you have to figure out what are the best possible things to focus on. What are the things that should sit in your foreground? Cognitive scientist John Verrochio calls this problem of having to select an appropriate sequence of actions within our fully packed but often encumbered minds. He calls this the relevance realization, which I highly recommend looking into. And then the third lesson that Leonardo learns from working in Verrochio's studio, which was this technique which he developed whilst working in the studio called sfumato. And I want to quote Isaacson directly here because he articulates this perfectly. He said, "When mastering drapery drawings in Verrochio's studio, Leonardo also pioneered sfumato, the technique of blurring contours and edges. It was a way for artists to render objects as they appear to the eye rather than with sharp contours. This advance caused Vasari to proclaim Leonardo the inventor of modern manner in painting. And the art historian Ernst Gombrich called sfumato Leonardo's famous invention, the blurred outline and mellowed colors that allow one form to merge with another and always leave something to our imagination. The term sfumato derived from the Italian word smoke, or more precisely, the dissipation of gradual vanishing of smoke in the air. Your shadows and lights should be blended without lines or borders in the manner of smoke losing itself in the air," he wrote in a series of maxims for young painters. And this is something that will prove to be an essential component to the particular nature of how, let's say, Leonardo's great painting, Mona Lisa's smile, changes when you're looking at it, where Leonardo applies sfumato to the corners of the smile to cloak them when you're looking at the smile directly, making it appear as though Mona Lisa is simply showing a neutral positioned mouth. But then when you look at the smile from a peripheral perspective, when you are eyeing up different parts of the painting besides the smile, then those corners reveal themselves, presenting the smile we all know is really there. And that was the beautiful technique of sfumato at play in Leonardo's work there. But I think a huge insight for us here is to apprentice ourselves within an environment that gives us that breadth of work to work from. In fact, these service-based businesses are usually the best place to do this. You know, designers often, when at university, and I experienced this myself as well, are often encouraged to work at agencies when they first start out, because whilst I don't really encourage this for the long term, at least in the short term, that variety of work and industries and clientele that you're exposed to is infinitely profound. That variety gives you the range. Working at VC firm would probably be the same as well in business, you know, being able to explore the ranges of different industries and problem areas gives your mind more to pull from, basically. And I think that's the genius of and beauty of working in these kind of environments. But Verrochio's studio was also a place where Leonardo would learn to do things his own way. And in Robert Greene's Mastery, there's a quote here that says, Verrochio instructed his apprentices in all the sciences that were necessary to produce the work of his studio, engineering, mechanics, and chemistry. Leonardo was eager to learn all these skills, but soon he discovered in himself something else. He could not simply do an assignment, he needed to make it something of his own, to invent rather than imitate the master. One time, as part of the studio work, he was asked to paint an angel in a larger biblical scene designed by Verrochio. And this was often the case, by the way, with professional painters who had their apprentices in their studio. You know, there would always be this debate about who painted what, because they would ask these apprentices to contribute certain sections of this overall scene that they were trying to paint. So a lot of the times that would be things in the background, like trees or mountainscapes and so on. But sometimes, if you're lucky enough as an apprentice, you would be asked to paint a character, like Leonardo was asked to do here with an angel. Robert Greene writes, he decided that he would make his portion of the scene come to life in his own way. In the foreground, in front of the angel, he painted a flower bed, but instead of the usual generalized rendering of plants, Leonardo depicted the flower specimens that he has studied in such detail as a child with a kind of scientific rigor that no one had seen before. You can see how those early observations of as a child, the kind of detail that he went to, and likely the distractions he gave himself are already starting to pay off by the time he's age 15. Amazing. For the angel's face, he experimented with his paints and mixed a new blend that gave him a kind of soft radiance that expressed the angel's sublime mood. To help capture this mood, Leonardo had spent time in the local church observing those in fervent prayer. And you can see this soft radiance that Robert Greene is talking about here, especially in facial features, to be a key part of Leonardo's work later on. When you look at the painting of the Virgin of the Rocks, which I highly recommend you do, you can do it if you're listening to this in the UK. You can actually do that for real in the National Gallery. It's amazing that they have that there. It's one of the first and only Leonardo paintings I've seen in person and spent a lot of time on multiple visits examining. But there's this smoothness and this glow of the skin that you can see on the characters depicted that, I'll never forget. It always stays with me because of how much it stands out, especially amongst the other paintings that are there. But when you hear people say things about other people's skin in person, you'll hear things like, wow, your skin is glowing. That's a phrase you often hear. But Leonardo was actually able to capture that and depict that in painting form. I mean, just an incredible skill that no one else was able to do at the time. Amazing innovation there from Leonardo. But back to mastery, Robert Greene writes, and finally, he determined that he would be able to be the first artist to create realistic angelic wings. For this purpose, he went to the marketplace and purchased several birds. He spent hours sketching their wings, how exactly they merged into their bodies. He wanted to create the sensation that these wings had organically grown from the angel's shoulders and would bring it to natural flight. As usual, Leonardo could not stop there. After his work was completed, he became obsessed with birds, and the idea brewed in his mind that perhaps a human could really fly. Now, several hours a week, he read and studied everything he could about birds. This was how his mind naturally worked. one idea flowed into another. And an insight for us to take note of here is that there's a beautiful method and process Leonardo had to capturing his curiosities and products that Isaacson notes, and I wanted to capture here, which is he said he would write down marching orders to himself, determining how he would sequence his observations in a methodical step-by-step way. He wasn't just observing and kind of, loosely making remarks. He was observing with detail and had a step-by-step process for doing it. He would build a step-by-step process for doing that. And there's an example of this in relation to the birds in Leonardo's notebooks that says, first define the motion of the wing and then describe how birds steer through it with only the simple balancing of the wings and tail. Do this after the description of their anatomy. And a side note to all of this is that when you skip ahead, after 20 years of Leonardo observing birds, he actually sets the intention to compile his own notes and publish them in an educational treatise. There's a section about this that says, much of the work was gathered into an 18-folio notebook, now known as the Codex on the Flight of Birds. It begins by exploring the concepts of gravity and density and ends by envisioning the launch of a flying machine he had designed and comparing its components with the body parts of a bird. But much like Leonardo's work, the treatise remained unfinished. Isaacson also says he was much more interested in nailing the concepts than he was in polishing them for publication. For anyone that spends 20 years observing birds, I'm not going to criticize them if they don't manage to finish publication. I think the process of observation and learning is one thing, publication is another. In fact, some people are very good at the publishing part, even if they don't go as deep in observation as Leonardo did. So I'm not going to criticize him here, but it also begins to highlight Leonardo's ability to think beyond what is already present in the world. You heard there about him envisioning the launch of a flying machine. And think of how you see travel, right, to another country being possible through flight right now. Naturally, you take this for granted, right? You book a flight, you complain about the prices, you get on the flight, it's a whole thing. But it's a method that exists for you today, has always existed, likely if you're listening to this podcast. But think also about how little you contemplate how else you might be able to travel to another country. I mean, sometimes you'll go for a boat, other times you might go by train. But beyond that, the options that are currently available to you, don't really think beyond those methods, right? Well, Leonardo, when he was alive, didn't even have flight as a method of transport, yet he contemplated it. He thought about it, predicting effectively what we all use now today and take for granted. So it's an amazing thing that Leonardo was doing there, and a great product that he only got, again, from being distracted, from spending 20 years observing birds when, some would say he was just a painter, right? And an amazing thing is that I actually saw a life-sized reproduction of the Flying Man, which was this concept that he devised in Rome airport as part of an exhibition. I don't think it's running anymore, unfortunately, but it was brilliant. And it was and Rome airport, by the way, Fiumicino, the airport, is also named Leonardo da Vinci. And the exhibition, I saw it back in 2019. It was part of the exhibition called The Wings of Leonardo, The Genius and Flight. It showed a few different things, but the thing that really sticks out for me is the Flying Man, the life-size reproduction of the Flying Man concept. I love when throughout history we've actually had many attempts to recreate designs that Leonardo may have only sketched in his notebooks or written about. We've seen them, and we've seen them being tested as well. So it's an amazing thing. Not the Flying Man, unfortunately, but I love that Leonardo was contemplating this. The insight for us here might be for us to let our reach exceed our grasp. Imagine, as he did, how you would build a human-powered flying machine or divert a river. I'm quoting here from Isaacson's book. Even try to devise a perpetual motion machine or square a circle using only a ruler and a compass. There are some problems we will never solve. Learn why. So far, I've mentioned Leonardo's notebooks a few times, but we should really take stock in the fact that these notebooks are still available. These books that I'm learning from, and the fact that we know so much about Leonardo today wouldn't have even been possible if it wasn't for the collection of over 7,200 pages from Leonardo's personal notebooks that he was writing in over 500 years ago. Isaacson would call these notebooks the greatest record of human curiosity. And the sort of things you find in Leonardo's notebooks, by the way, they reflect him as an artist because he sketched ideas and he made drawings in preparation for paintings. As an engineer, he honed his technical skills by drawing mechanisms he encountered and imagined. As a court impresario, who is someone who kind of organizes and often finances concerts, plays, or operas, we're going to get into that part of his career, he jotted down designs for costumes, contrivances for machines and sceneries and stages, fables to be enacted and witty lines to be performed. He had these to-do lists, but he also had these to-learn lists. I love that. He wasn't just saying what he needed to accomplish, he was asking himself in the mornings what he needed to learn that day. As his scientific study got more serious, he filled those pages with outlines and passages for treatises on topics such as flight, water, anatomy, art, horses, mechanics, and geology. And even if we don't have those in published form, it's amazing that we still have those notebooks of the preparation, the process. I actually kind of like that more than a fully published format. Something that comes straight to mind and something I will put an episode to focus on is that of Francis Ford Coppola's notebooks that he carried for the production of the first Godfather film. It was this huge binder. It's now called the Godfather Notebook, but it was this huge binder he had where he took a A4 sheet and he cut a little window in it. And the window allowed him to stick an individual page from the book by Mario Puzo, The Godfather, stick it into that window. And then he would write in the rest of the, A4 sheet notes against each section of that page, whether it was relevant to what he would create in the film, whether there were details he wanted to capture in the film. The one that comes straight to mind is he would highlight and underline all the details within the description of the wedding scene that he would depict in the film. He felt that these were really important, and if he didn't capture them in the film, then he would be missing the authentic notion of what an Italian traditional wedding might look like. The things that would give Italians the view that, okay, this is capturing some part of my childhood, something I've experienced before, and something that was really important to Francis Ford Coppola. But I love that there's a process. There is a published version, but the published version, which I've got, is actually just photocopies of that, much more rough and process-driven. There are some pages that just have big lines of crossing through them because that's another thing that we capture in his process, something that wouldn't go to publication, but we have there because of the process that was captured on paper. In Da Vinci's notebooks, we even get little hints at things that he discovered years before others did. For example, he may have understood the role of acceleration in gravity a whole century before Isaac Newton did, because there's an intricate diagram that replicates his findings from an experiment he ran. So these notebooks are incredible. Isaacson writes, because good paper was costly, Leonardo tried to use every edge and corner of most pages, cramming as much as possible on each sheet and jumbling together seemingly random items from diverse fields. He would often also go back to the same page years later and refine his discoveries. So that means, let's take an example of one page. It could include a metaphor in the form of a drawing or a doodle of an old man, which also has leaves from branchless trees connecting to his toga to help him appreciate the unity of nature and the similarities between the aorta system and the artery system within the blood system and the rules that govern the branching systems of trees and leaves. It's this connection between man and nature. But that very same page could also include geometrical drawings of a conical shape with equilateral triangles, which hinted at his long attempt to solve the mathematical challenge again of squaring a circle, something we'll come back to in the Vitruvian Man. When I keep saying we'll come back to things, I promise we will, but it's the way that I've had to structure this podcast. There's so much to talk about with Leonardo that a lot has to be held in promise. I actually was really lucky and had the pleasure of seeing a lot of the pages from his notebooks in an exhibition at the Queen's Gallery, which was just incredible. And you can see how each page was crammed with so much to examine. And there's one example in regards to the grotesques that will always stick out to me. But I also got to see a lot of his engineering designs as well. But these might seem random, but Isaacson says the joys of these juxtapositions is that they allow us to marvel at the beauty of a universal mind as it wanders exuberantly in free-range fashion over the arts and sciences, and by doing so, the sense of connections in our cosmos. We can extract from his pages, as he did from nature's, the patterns that underlie the things that first appear disconnected. And if this doesn't hint to the brilliance of Leonardo, I don't know what would. But the big insight for me when taking a moment to acknowledge Leonardo's notebooks is to capture everything. It may seem as though you're adding layers of complexity to your morning routine or your process of the day-to-day as an artist, but journaling, sketching, writing, these are all means of you non-judgmentally allowing the ramblings in your mind to sit outside your mind. Even if they make no sense or are seemingly unusable, I find that the act of writing for 30 minutes or so just allows you to get into a state of flow. I do it before I record these podcasts, actually, because it gives me an ability to just allow myself to arrive in a place of flow. And rather than being halted by the pressure of having to go straight into the podcast, for you as an artist to go straight into writing the best thing you've ever written or painting the best painting you've ever done, just to allow yourself to draw or paint or sketch in something that, you might even throw away at the end. I often do. I write on pieces of paper that I will throw away. Maybe Leonardo would be upset by that, but at least to remove that filter of I need to have written something perfect. I need to create something perfect, but instead to allow yourself to just ease into the flow of creating and producing and allowing what comes from your mind to come into the world. Isaacson advises us to retain our childlike sense of wonder. I think this is important as well. He says, at a certain point in life, most of us quit puzzling over everyday phenomena. We might savor the beauty of a blue sky, but we no longer wonder why it is that color. Leonardo did. We should be careful to never outgrow our wonder years or to let our children do so. And I think these notebooks are evidence that he never did outgrow these years. I think of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's an American writer that I love, who said, a man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within. It's the thing that makes you excited. It's the things that, the small, nuanced details that flash across your mind that you should pay attention to and question and ask always, just as Leonardo did. And it's that wonder that would carry Leonardo to burrow deeply into everything that he observed. Isaacson points out that Leonardo's notebooks seem to be missing the personal, intimate goings-on. It doesn't have his thoughts about how he feels about himself. It's not the personal diary of Leonardo. These are notebooks, but he instead describes them as the outward-looking enthrallments of a relentlessly curious explorer. One thing you'll notice in a lot of his notebooks are his drawings of military engineering. This is something I saw a lot in the exhibition I went to. There are lots on defense, transportation, and architectural forms, which brings me to the focus of how he first flirted with the idea of working on those in a professional capacity, as well as when he made his biggest military contribution. This is probably something that very few people know. I want to go straight into the book here as it says, as he approached his 30th birthday, Leonardo had established his genius, but he had remarkably little to show for it publicly. His only known artistic accomplishment were some of the brilliant but peripheral contributions to 2 Verrochio paintings that were hard to distinguish from others being produced in the workshop, a portrait of a young woman that he had not delivered and 2 unfinished would-be masterpieces. So, Leonardo would travel to Milan. And for context, the castles of the 125,000 citizens of Milan, which was 3 times the size of Florence, mind you, belonged to the heads of the Visconti family and then the Sforza family. This is important because the Sforza family are who Leonardo directly appeals to. For further context, because their ambitions were grand, but their claims to titles were tenuous, the castles were filled with courtiers, artists, performers, musicians, huntsmasters, statescrafters, animal trainers, engineers, and any other helper or ornaments who could burnish their privilege and legitimacy. In other words, Milan's castles provided a perfect environment for Leonardo, who had a fondness for strong leaders and loved the diversity of talent they attracted and aspired to be on a comfortable retainer. This is the profitable part of Leonardo's art. But it makes me think this is how someone like Leonardo would ever come to learn about other professions and areas to master. We take the internet for granted now, we with things like LinkedIn that gives us a range of professions and ideas to easily discover. Isaacson here writes, unlike Florence, Milan was not well stocked with master artists. That made it more fertile territory for Leonardo. But because he was an aspiring polymath, He also enjoyed that Milan was filled with scholars and intellectuals in a wide variety of fields. This actually reminds me of something a friend of mine just told me recently, who works in the fitness industry, and he was talking about this new gym that's been set up recently that gives personal trainers access to the minds and skills of other professionals. So people like nutritionists, physiotherapists, doctors, and it allows these personal trainers to constantly expand their support for clients, but also allowing them to constantly be stimulated by the wider variety a standard gym couldn't usually offer. It's why I strongly believe in the power of those Day of a Life videos on YouTube. I don't know if you've ever seen any of them, but they have someone who, let's say works in a profession and speaks to the day of a life in that profession. That's going to have an impact on people knowing about a certain profession even existing, right? As well as being able to imagine what it would be like to work for them. And I think even for me, I've had a career as a product designer, but I think that's mostly because when I was 14, a mentor of mine told me about a friend of theirs who worked as a user experience designer. So at 14, how are you going to know about an industry and even set the goal of, working as a product designer had you not known that role ever existed, or that was a way of validating the cross-reference of technology and media and design that I had at the time and the interest that I had at the time, without being told that there's already a role that does fulfill that, right? So I think that's why being exposed to different professions is so important, especially when you're young. And Milan gave way for Leonardo to do that. So soon after Leonardo arrived in Milan, he wrote this letter to Ludovico Sforza, who was the ruler of Milan at the time. The letter itself is worth studying, and I won't read out the entire letter, but it is a masterclass for selling your own value, but also in recognizing your audience and adapting to them. Because the letter itself is the coolest job application letter I've ever read, and probably ever in history. It's 11 paragraphs long, and the first 10 paragraphs are about engineering. Mind you, he's just come from Florence, where he's been an apprentice painter, but 10 out of the 11 paragraphs are about engineering. It's about how he can build great buildings. It's about making weapons of war. It's about how he can divert the course of rivers. But it's only in the 11th paragraph that he says, also, I can execute sculpture in marble, bronze, and clay. Likewise, in painting, I can do everything possible, as well as any other man, whomever so he may be. And although that's a great way to brag about your own skills and sell your own value, it's interesting that Leonardo never mentions any of his paintings. And in fact, he doesn't even refer to being able to make sculptures or paintings until after he lists 10 things that he was able to do, which, whilst they were boasts, were aspirational. He had never been to battle or ever built any weapons that he had described. All that he had produced were some elegant sketches in his notebooks, which, fine, it was interesting concepts of weapons, but they were mostly fanciful and they weren't practical. But this was something that Leonardo did that was very smart, which was that he called out and addressed any possible doubts that Ludovico, the reader, the audience, may have had at the time. He recognized that Ludovico was much more likely to hire someone in their castle in the pretense that they could create weapons, maybe more so than being able to create art. Or perhaps this was a way, of course, for Leonardo to introduce his more artistic pursuits, disguised under the fact that they were just a mere afterthought that Ludovico could discover himself, noting that the last paragraph, when talking about architecture, for example, he starts with, in times of peace. Right now it's war, but in times of peace, I can also offer these skills. And maybe if you hire me now, then in the future, in times of peace, we can work on those things. But perhaps still, this was also an attempt to make himself available for a broader set of responsibilities within the castle. After all, we learnt from Anthony Bourdain in episode 3 that as artists, we should be careful of the labels we give ourselves. We shouldn't be quick to label ourselves as one thing. We should keep ourselves open and make sure they never constrain us. But most of all, we can learn from this letter that it was clear in Leonardo's own mind that he was going to be more than a painter. He was going to be a man of science and engineering. Isaacson writes, his letter to Ludovico is thus best regarded not as a reliable catalogue of his actual engineering accomplishments, but instead as a glimpse into his hopes and ambitions. As amazing as that was, he never actually worked as a military engineer until years later after he left Milan. But yes, he did end up eventually working in the professional capacity as a military engineer. And whilst you may be wondering how this could possibly fall under the makeup of him being an icon as an artist, there is one thing that he innovated on that I would absolutely consider as part of his art and would give us a lot to learn from. Leonardo was installed at Cesare Borgia's newly acquired fort in the town of Imola. And Cesare, by the way, was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and ultimately the power-hungry ruler of much of Italy. And it was when Cesare went to see the painting of the Last Supper that he first met Leonardo. Well, great introduction, firstly, but, you know, it's here that Leonardo would show Cesare much of his military engineering design. So even years after having written that letter that he sent to Ludovico Sforza, he is still talking about these engineering designs. So I think he's always got these designs in mind as something he wants to make real. And he was attracted to those powerful men who could probably enable that. But how Leonardo contributed towards Cesare's military efforts once he was hired was to create something that Isaacson calls a work of beauty, innovative style, and military utility. It combines in his inimitable manner, art, and science. And this was something he built to help Borgia learn the territory of Imola. And this was at the time a map. Yes, that's what we're talking about. A map here was in hillside view, and that was kind of a view that you could take from standing at the top of the hill. And often in these maps, by the way, they were artistic, right? They had mythical creatures popping up in the waters, which was not great for military operations, right? And the perspective only showed some buildings because the angle would mean that other buildings would be blocked from view from bigger ones and so on. But Leonardo needed to show Imola as an iconographic map. This was an idea that Vitruvius, someone we'll come back to later, a Roman engineer who was the guy who inspired this, had described in a book that he wrote. But Leonardo took this idea. And an iconographic map, by the way, is a map where everything looks like you're directly above whatever you show. It gives you a clearer picture, similar to the real view from far above, where distance reduces the effects of shifting perspective, which is something that you would run into with a hillside map. But obviously Leonardo hadn't invented a way to fly, and he didn't have a satellite to take pictures from. So how did he make this map of Imola, and how did he make it so accurate? Because if he did, which he did, this was a feat that was true innovation. What he probably did was he used this type of disc called a bussola, which could measure the degrees and had a little pointer to mark the angles of streets in relation to a stable point, usually north. And he would probably use a compass to record the orientation of the town's surrounding walls. And he did this at every turn, so, which helped him, accurately translate those walls onto paper. And to establish scale, Leonardo also needed to measure the distance between all these angles. So he probably paced this out by foot using a odometer, which is the thing that has wheels that you would push. You probably did this at school like I did, where you would push these wheels and it would make this clicking sound at every meter. Well, he had a slightly different device that would have turned gears that measured the distance of it with a dropping of a stone into a bucket. When you see the map as well, it's been folded many times. So this kind of indicates that probably Leonardo would carry this in his pocket whenever he was out. So he was, again, constantly working on this, and it was something he iterated on constantly. And with the angles and distance together, he could create a plan, something that would be an incredible contribution to the military efforts of Cesare Borgia, but done so hundreds of years before anyone else could even check if he got it right. He did, by the way. It's a very accurate map. But the fact is, it would take hundreds of years. And this is something consistent with a lot of the things that Leonardo did, which is he did something and then it would take hundreds of years for someone to do it again. He was truly ahead of his time. But ultimately, it came to be useful as it allowed Cesare Borgia to conduct these lightning strikes. And in the words of Machiavelli, who you might recognize the name, he was a military strategist and consultant for Cesare at the time, who said he was able to install himself, Cesare was able to install himself in someone else's house before anyone noticed in moments of war as well. So this map came to really be very advantageous for Cesare Borgia at the time. It does highlight, again, Leonardo's ability to not find any limitations, right? Just like with the flight idea, he didn't go, well, you can't get up there in order to draw a map from above. He thought about how he could do so without ever leaving the ground. So This is exactly how he became known as an innovator as well as an artist. And you can see this map actually on the walls in Leonardo's studio in Assassin's Creed 2. Yes, I did have to revisit the studio in Assassin's Creed 2 to just confirm that this was actually the case when I learned about this. And yes, you do see the map. So I love that the creators of the game there recognized this was a key contribution of Leonardo's. But upon first arriving to Milan, Leonardo did find work with Sforza, but it just wasn't in that architect or engineer or military capacity. In fact, it was instead as a court impresario, a term that I used earlier, right? Which means that you're kind of this producer of arts and crafts in order to entertain. And to be fair, this was not completely outside of Leonardo's realm. He had already expressed great interest and fantasies and stories whilst working in Verrochio's studio, but in arguably one of Leonardo's most productive periods he worked in, he produced so much as a court impresario. He created stage designs, music, sceneries, mechanisms, choreography, allegorical allusions, and gadgets. And it's funny because Walter Isaacson raises an interesting point here. He notes that from our advantage of centuries later, the time and creativity Leonardo applied to such ephemeral affairs seem wasted. The word ephemeral, by the way, here meaning kind of that temporary nature that doesn't remain, right? You could describe the majority of the millions of thoughts that you have a day as being ephemeral unless you're capturing them in a notebook like Leonardo was. But it's interesting because he's right. Like in a sense, he is right. When you're looking at an artist through the lens of legacy, when you take a step back and you look at the hundreds of years of impact that work has had, which we often do when we're talking about those artists and who are dead, you can't help but think that the work that didn't remain, stuff like stage performances that only remain as long as the show's running, is futile and therefore less valuable. But we can't deny that this work was likely very valuable in the time that it was being shown. For Ludovico and the Sforza family, first of all, for their rule, it was definitely valuable because Ludovico loved that the production would call on historical and religious imagery, the kind of legitimizing his ruling through association. A lot of powerful people did this to justify their existence. They would attach themselves to ideas that are pious in nature, religious, and maybe otherworldly to kind of elevate their own status as well. And it's likely that the respect gained from this association helped, Ludovico bring in all these great people from all kinds of artistic disciplines to come and work for him, from architects to mechanics, musicians, poets, performers, and even military engineers. It was also very valuable to those attending the show because, as Isaacson notes in the book, that these entertainments were often educational as well as being entertaining. They were often a demonstration of science. They included debates over relative values and merits of different art forms, and were displays of ingenious devices, which were all kind of a precursor to the public science and illuminating discussions that would actually become popular later during the Enlightenment period, which was like a great period of intellectual progress during the 17th and 18th century. So way later, but this was all kind of happening in the Ludovico court, in the Sforza court even. I would love to have attended some of these shows. I think they probably really captured the imagination and allowed you to walk away with so many things to think about, right? So again, I think that at the time, these things would have been extremely valuable things for Leonardo to work on. Just again, showing that Leonardo was ahead of his time, Isaacson actually describes the shows as being kind of ideas festivals. There's a great example actually when he designs a 5-act comedy play called Le Danne, and he filled this performance with special effects like an intricate system of ropes and pulleys that helped descend Mercury as a planet from above, and had Jupiter transform into rain of gold dust to impregnate Danae. So there's lots of things going on, and at one point actually had the ceiling light up with an infinite number of lamps to represent the stars in the sky, which is very impressive again when you think of this being achieved in the 15th century, no less. Ultimately, it's actually something much smaller in scale that he worked on whilst he was the court impresario that I want to emphasize for the sake of learning from Leonardo. If you recall earlier, I said that when I went to the Queen's Gallery exhibition of Leonardo's notebooks, I noted that of these drawings called the grotesques. And what they were these pen and ink caricature drawings that he did, at the time was called visi monstrosi, which translates to monstrous faces, which is now known more commonly as the grotesques. And these were brilliant, by the way, because they're designed to be satirical and were likely accompanied by spoken tales or jokes or performances that were done at the castles in Milan. But to draw them, Leonardo would walk the streets with a notebook dangling from his belt and would find a group of people with exaggerated features who would make for good models. Leonardo writes to himself in his notebook, "As you go about town, constantly observe and note and consider the circumstances and behaviors of men as they quarrel and talk or laugh or come to blows." He also writes, "Take a note of them with slight strokes in a notebook, which you should also carry with you, and the positions of the people are so infinite that memory is incapable of retaining them, which is why you should keep these sketches as your guides." I immediately want to highlight here this notion of constantly observing and noting the circumstances and behaviors of men. This is going to be a very important point for us to think about here. But I've seen plenty of artists on Instagram who sketch people even on like the train, and have actually got an illustrator friend myself who I've been on holiday with, and we went to Rome, and he spent a lot of time actually sketching in his notebook and just sitting and observing, much like Leonardo did, and sketching people, sketching statues. And I've even got a brother who does the same, and he's an urban designer, so he does the same with buildings. And I think it's a wonderful thing, but it is funny to think how Leonardo would essentially find who he deemed to be monstrous in the face, and you would use that for inspiration. But Leonardo would then invite those people he noticed in the street into his home and host them for dinner. He would then actually make them comfortable and tell them the most ridiculous stories and tales he knew in order to make them laugh loudly. He then observed all their different facial movements, their gestures, and all the other little details that allowed them to impress on his mind, so that after they left, he could retire to his room and make drawings of them all. This is likely massively improving his ability to retain things in his mind, because he does obviously note that the sketches are essential in order to keep all the details. But when you see these drawings, you will see evidence of that, as I was lucky enough to do so. He did, admittedly though, have a trick up his sleeve to make things easier. He started to develop the shorthand. For example, he would have 11 types of face shapes generally, and then like 10 different types of noses. So he would mentally make a note of those, so that he didn't need to remember every detail, but rather just those that had the kind of unrepeatable, ephemeral uniqueness to them. But I think what this exercise highlights, more so than having to worry about if you're ever invited to Leonardo's house for dinner, is actually how Leonardo thought about facial features and how those facial features and animations would relate to inner emotions. It was Aristotle who once declared that it is possible to infer character from features. Isaacson actually notes in the book here that people had, in a study known as physiognomy, tried to find ways to assess people's innate personality from their head shapes and facial characteristics. And even though Leonardo didn't consider physiognomy a science, he did believe that facial expressions indicate underlying causes. He wrote, "The face partly revealed the character of men, their vices and temperaments. For example, strong lines on the forehead can be associated with regret." He also noted the heavy lines between the eyebrows could be associated with bad temper, but Leonardo was fascinated by the expression of inner emotions on outward-facing qualities, and this would become one of his most artistic innovations, actually. I think of the painting of Ginevra da Vinci, whose eyelids are described by Isaacson as studiously modeled to appear three-dimensional, but this also makes them feel heavy, appearing to add a somber demeanor. Her gaze looks distracted and indifferent, as though she's looking through us and seeing nothing. And another example of Leonardo's desire to capture the inner emotions on outward-facing qualities comes from a time when he shared a studio with another portrait artist that Ludovico Sforza loved, and how his half-brothers, Evangelista and Cristoforo, were deaf and they didn't speak. And Leonardo actually notes this to himself. He says, "Let your figures have actions appropriate to what they are intended to think or say, and these will be well learned by imitating the deaf, who by the motion of their hands, eyes, eyebrows, and their whole body endeavor to express the sentiments of their mind. I love this. He was telling himself to note how the deaf communicate as a good way to study the relationship between human gestures and thoughts. Amazing observation there. And so an insight for us here could be to study the most exaggerated versions of the truth that we're trying to capture, right? That to understand anger, we should seek out examples of rage. To understand joy, we should seek out examples of elation. And then it's your choice to tone down those depictions in your interpretations. But Leonardo was obviously keeping the most exaggerated forms, at least for his drawings. But in his paintings, you'll see a toned down version from what he was drawing before. And there were times where Leonardo, by the way, studied human anatomy in cadavers in the morgues. His dedication to understanding and being able to portray the outward displays of inner process actually led him to look at the nerves, which some emanated from the brain and then some actually from the spinal cord, to which muscles they activated, as well as which facial movements were connected to others. He would even dissect the brain at one point in an attempt to pinpoint the kind of precise location where the connections were made between sensory perceptions and emotion. This phenomenon he was attempting to always capture is actually known as atti e moti mentali, which means the attitudes or emotions of the mind. And to end this idea, Isaacson quotes Alberti, who was a Renaissance humanist writer who was able to wonderfully emphasize the importance of this idea in a sentence that says, movements of the soul are made known by the movements of the body. Let's say that again. Movements of the soul are made known by movements of the body. Speaking of the body, whilst in Milan, Leonardo actually discovered a connection between the body and architecture that would produce work that was, in my mind, the best representation, and I'm very excited to talk about this, of all that Leonardo da Vinci was. In 1487, Leonardo was presented with an opportunity to establish his credentials as an architect when Milan's authorities sought out ideas for building a lantern tower on top of their cathedral. The tower is known as a tuburio. So for the tuburio project, Leonardo put forward a design that had him first do a dissection of what caused structural weaknesses in buildings. And as part of this, Leonardo did a systematic study of the origins of fissures or cracks in walls. To this, he actually wrote, "The cracks that are vertical are caused by joining of new walls with old ones, for the indentations cannot bear the great weight of the wall added onto them, so it is inevitable that they should break." And with these learnings, and to stabilize the more precarious sections of the Milan Cathedral that had sat there for years, Leonardo put forward a design that included an amazing system of supports to kind of fortify this area around this tuburio that he proposed. And it's a concept that he actually prompted him to devise an experiment to demonstrate its efficacy. The experiment, he writes himself here, the experiment showed that a weight placed on an arch would not discharge itself entirely on its columns. On the contrary, the greater the weight placed on the arches, the less the arch transmits the weight to the columns. Let a man be placed on a weighing device in the middle of a well shaft, then have him push out his hands and feet against the walls of the well. You will find that he weighs much less on the scales. If you put weight on his shoulders, you will see for yourself that the more weight you put on him, the greater will be the force with which he spreads his arms and legs and presses against the wall, and the less will be his weight on the scales. What an amazing representation of how physics works there. And as well as this, the tower he proposed would have this beautiful double-shelled dome, which would display a four-sided one on the outside and then an octagonal one on the inside. This is really showcasing how his understanding of beauty would make its way into Leonardo's fascinations with architecture. But despite this proposal, Milan's authorities would find themselves stuck, and they would actually call upon an expert with greater experience brought over from Siena, Francesco di Giorgio. And Giorgio's proposal, which was more like a ornate and octagonal in its Gothic style tower, which can still be seen, by the way, in Milan today, was ultimately chosen to be implemented. But that being said, Leonardo, nevertheless, remained interested in church designs, and thank God he did because of what's to come. He went on to make 70 more drawings of domes and plans of church interiors, and he was doing this whilst also studying the transformation of shapes, and in particular, the ways to square a circle. I've said this enough times that I need to fulfill that promise, because here's a math problem for you. Let's take the area of a circle, which is that you take the value of pi, sorry for this maths class, but you take the value of pi and you multiply it by the radius squared. And let's take the area of a square, which is you multiply the base by itself. But how can I take area of a circle and create a square with an equal area using only a compass and a straight edge? Well, before you think about this too much, this problem is often called squaring a circle. But as it turns out, this problem is impossible to solve because of the nature of pi, which German mathematician Ferdinand von Lindmann actually did prove in 1882. And you're free to look into this yourself, as this isn't a maths podcast. This is all I'm going to say about it. But the problem will constantly be on Leonardo's mind, and the way it integrates with his interest in churches at the time is truly fascinating, because Leonardo and Francesco di Giorgio were sent to the town of Pavia after this Tiburio project as consultants, where a new cathedral was being built. But it was on this trip that they would discover a very interesting and influential treatise on architecture written by a Roman military officer and engineer from the 1st century BC. His name was Marcus Vitruvius. And if you know anything about Leonardo's works, you might recognize the name. But if you don't worry, because even if you did recognize the name, it's unlikely that you know the full story here, because Vitruvius was most notably serving in the Roman army under Caesar and specialized in the design and construction of artillery machines. But later in his life, he became an architect who worked on a temple in the town of Fano in Italy. But the remaining work of his was what would capture Leonardo. It was a book that Vitruvius wrote called De Architectura, which is known today as the 10 Books of Architecture. Both Leonardo and Francesco would take complete fascination in particular with the way in which the book gave concrete expression, and Leonardo and Francesco became obsessed with this book because they had so many concepts illustrated in it. One of the ones that they found particular fascination with was the way in which the book gave concrete expression to the analogy that become the defining metaphor of Renaissance humanism. It's the one that Isaacson beautifully notes as the relationship between the microcosm of man and the macrocosm of the earth. The foundational seeds of what were to come were planted, as Leonardo writes to himself. The ancients called man a lesser world, and certainly the use of this name is well bestowed, because his body is an analogy for the world. In the book, Vitruvius decreed that the layout of a temple should reflect the proportions of a human body, as if the body were kind of laid out flat on his back upon the geometric forms of the floor plan. More generally, Vitruvius actually writes, the design of a temple depends on symmetry. There must be a precise relation between its components, as there is in the case of those of a well-shaped man. And Vitruvius does actually describe this in great detail, this proportion of a well-shaped man that should inform the design of a temple. He said, the length of a foot is 1/6 of the height of the body, for the forearm 1/4, and the breadth of the breast is also 1/4. The other members too have their own symmetrical proportions, and it was by employing them that famous painters and sculptors of antiquity attained to great and endless renown. Vitruvius actually spoke to this ability to capture the well-proportioned man as being equal to being able to create great art. And I'm sure in future episodes of Icons, we'll be looking more explicitly at how sculptors kind of discovered the perfect proportions for the figures they sculpted. But it is a powerful image because, as far as we know, no one of note had made a serious and precise representative drawing before Leonardo and his friends Giorgio and Giacomo Andrea, another member of the circle of architects and engineers that populated Ludovico's court, all proceeded to tackle this depiction of man amidst a church and the universe. These sketches, as Leonardo writes, sought to harmonize the proportions of a human to that of a church, an effort that would culminate with an iconic drawing that came to symbolize the harmonious relationship between man and the universe. And whilst Andrea and Giorgio's drawings were great attempts, there is a reason why Leonardo's drawing of the Vitruvian Man, which you've probably heard of, is so famous, whilst the others remain less so. Leonardo's drawing gives the man, who stands firmly and stares right at us, 4 arms and 4 legs. But when you examine it thoroughly with the context of the mathematical problem that I mentioned earlier of squaring the circle, you'll start to understand why. Because on the set of the arms and legs allow the man to fill the area of a circle, while the other arms and legs allow man to fill the square. Again, Leonardo took these ideas directly from the writings of Vitruvius, who went on to describe the way you can put a man in a circle and in a square in a way to determine the ideal proportions of a church. He writes, "In the human body, the center point is the navel. If a man is placed flat on his back, with his hands and feet extended, a compass centered at his navel, his fingers and toes will touch the circumference of a circle thereby described. And just as the human body yields the circular outline, so too a square can be found from it. For if we measure the distance from the soles of the feet to the top of the head, and then apply that measurement to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same height as in the case of a perfect square." And the notion of the square, at least, is actually very simple to understand if you examine how Vitruvius notes there that the length of the outstretched arms are roughly equal to that of the height of a man. I actually remember learning this at school and being shocked by the fact that my middle fingers on my hands would equate to the same length as the top of my head to my feet. Toby Lester, a writer, said about the drawing of the Vitruvian Man that it manages to embody the timeless hope that we might just have the power of mind to figure out how we fit into the grand scheme of things. And looking back at the sketch, we can definitely see that by the changing position of the man, that he can fill the impossible problem of being both the areas of the square and the circle. So if geometry is the language that the universe is written in, then this sketch seems to say that we can exist within all its elements, that mankind can fill whatever shape he pleases geometrically and philosophically as well. This is why Vitruvian Man is such an impactful piece. And when you recognize, like Isaacson does in this book, that this is likely an idealized self-portrait by Leonardo da Vinci, made clear by the curly hair that he was known to have, then we can note that this is also Leonardo as an artist looking back at himself, trying to grasp the secrets of his own nature. And whilst this might not be him producing his most impressive work from a skill display standpoint when pitted against the other more famous paintings of his, what's incredible is that in this one sketch, Leonardo was able to combine his display of his love of mathematics, religion, philosophy, architecture, and art, making Vitruvian Man the most representative metaphor, if you will, of who Leonardo da Vinci was. So, there's a reason I wanted to spend so much time talking about this. And an insight we can definitely take from this is that we should collaborate, right? Isaacson actually writes that genius is often considered the purview of loners who retreat to their garrets and are struck by creative lightning. And like many myths, that of the lone genius has some truth to it. But usually there's more to the story. Vitruvian Man was produced after sharing ideas and sketches with friends, and his most fun work came from the collaborations on the theatrical productions and evening entertainments at the Sforza court. Genius starts with individual brilliance because it requires a singular vision, but executing it often entails working with others. Creativity is a collaborative endeavor. When reading that, the person that came to mind was actually Christopher Nolan, because we think of Christopher Nolan as this individual genius. But of course, he needs the collaborators that he has. He has his wife as a lead producer. He has his incredible cinematographers that he's worked with in order to capture the visions that he has. And notably, for me at least, is that he has his brother, Jonathan Nolan, who was the writer for a lot of his films, particularly for his first studio film, which was Memento, because that was born out of a short story that Jonathan Nolan had written already. So they both shared this fascination and with the perception of time, and both sought to create artistic expressions and representations of this skewed version of time, right? But the final product that we know most, Memento, would not have come about had it not been for that shared vision being collaborated on and likely discussed endlessly between the two brothers. Now, in the introduction, I spoke about how Leonardo is famous for his unfinished works. Well, relinquishing a work, declaring it finished, froze its evolution. Leonardo did not like to do that. There was always something more to be learned, another stroke to be gleaned from nature that would make the picture closer to perfect. This is obviously taken from Walter Isaacson. And on that, there is one painting that shows this evidently. And I did hint to this earlier on in the episode, but I will finish this podcast with it. It's the unfinished painting of Saint Jerome in the wilderness. And Saint Jerome was a 4th century scholar who translated the Bible into Latin during his retreat as a hermit in the desert. And the painting shows Saint Jerome in a background that's not too dissimilar, by the way, in tone and structure as the Virgin of the Rocks, the painting I also mentioned earlier, but has a prominent Saint Jerome in an interesting posture. He's kneeling, almost as though he's praying, but with one arm outstretched and twisted, holding a rock that he will allegedly beat against his chest in penance. By his feet is the lion that is said to have been his companion after he pulled a thorn from the paw of the lion. The saint, as Isaacson describes, is haggard and emancipated, exuding shame as he seems to implore forgiveness, yet his eyes show his inner strength. And the thing is, Leonardo's paintings are all psychological artifacts of his incessant desire to portray the inner emotions that I talked about earlier. But to me, the painting of Saint Jerome might show this most intensely. He became obsessed with this notion that Renaissance humanist Alberti, who I mentioned earlier, pointed to, that the artist should conceive a body from the inside out. Leonardo, about this, wrote, "It is necessary for the painter, in order to be good at arranging the parts of the body in attitudes and gestures which can be represented in the nude, to know the anatomy of sinews, bones, and muscles and tendons." And of course, these are things he got to understand very intimately when he was doing the dissection work that he was doing. But the thing I want to focus on here is that he began the work on St. Jerome in the wilderness in 1480. And the years and dates that I've mentioned previously aren't as important as the ones I'll note here, which is, again, he worked on this in 1480. But there is something peculiar to note about it. The painting actually seems to accurately reflect the anatomical knowledge that he only gleaned 30 years later from the dissections he made in 1510. So again, a painting he started in 1480, but it has accurate depictions of some anatomical component that he only learned about in 1510. This is most particularly the case with the way that his neck muscles activate in certain head postures, which St. Jerome has in this interesting posture that he sits in. But the thing is, when you look, in fact, at the drawing that Leonardo made of Judas around 1495, 15 years after he started St. Jerome, but 15 years before he started doing the dissection work in 1510, and you can actually see that he is mistakenly shown the muscle that travels up from the collarbone to the side of the neck as a singular muscle, rather than the pair of muscles that it actually is. A detail that he will learn from the dissection work he did 30 years after the initial drawing of St. Jerome in the wilderness. So how is this possible? Let's think about this. How is it possible that in 1480, he had accurately depicted the neck muscles as two muscles, and then 15 years later, he mistakenly portrays the neck muscle as being only one muscle for the drawing in preparation for the Last Supper? And yet in 1510, he learns accurately that there are actually two muscles in this neck muscle. How is that the case? How is it that 30 years before he understood, he got it right, 15 years later, he got it wrong, and then eventually learned the truth? Well, it's clear that the only explanation is that he went back 30 years after having started the St. Jerome painting in order to finish it with the accurate neck. He had updated the painting 30 years later, and this is why I wanted to talk about the painting, because Leonardo clung to his favorite works, as Walter Isaacson says. He says he carried them with him whenever he moved, and he returned to them whenever he had new ideas. And he certainly did this with St. Jerome. He did not like to let go. That is why he would die with some of his masterpieces next to his bedside. As frustrating as it is to us today, there was a poignant and inspiring aspect to Leonardo's unwillingness to declare a painting done and relinquish it. He knew there was always more to learn, new techniques he might master, and further inspirations that might strike him. And he was right. So that's why I wanted to highlight this painting, because as a final lesson for us, it's important to note that Leonardo struggled to finish paintings because he always wanted to learn, and he wanted them to be a close representation, very close representation of the truth. It's why he did his dissections. It's why he went on the tangents that he did through life about learning about birds and learning how water works and learning how mouths move. That's a big part of how he was able to accurately depict the transitory nature of the smile that Mona Lisa has. And ultimately in St. Jerome's painting, you can see that even the detail of two muscles in the neck that perhaps he had some sense was probably wrong, or he was working from an approximation as opposed to a specific piece of knowledge that he had. And the fact that he would have this throughout his work really speaks to a level of detail and perfectionism that made Leonardo da Vinci a greater painter than many of his contemporaries. It's why he's one of my favorite artists. It's why I had to make this episode on him so early on in the series of icons. And so when I come up with a word to describe the Renaissance man that I love, the word that comes to mind is expansive. But another word that could also be used is inspired, which in Latin means something from outside breathing within us. Isaacson writes that Leonardo's curiosity impelled him to become among the handful of people in history who tried to know all that there was to know about everything that could be known. He was the epitome of the universal mind, one who sought to understand all of creation, including how we fit into it. The Japanese swordsman, philosopher, and strategist that I love, Miyamoto Musashi, actually notes this idea that if you know the way broadly, you will see it in all things, that the underlying principles of learning about all things are the same if you go deep enough. And that once you start understanding those principles, you'll see that they're relevant to everything. And I kept that in mind because by this very nature that Leonardo had, it really dispels the notion that you can only be one type of person, that you can only be a scientific bent person or an artistic or creative type. An excuse I've definitely used myself to excuse, poor math grades at school, but Leonardo definitely gives me no breathing room there. And ultimately, Leonardo wrote in his notebooks, just as a well-filled day brings blessed sleep, so a well-employed life brings a blessed death. And I truly hope he had one, because he definitely had the well-employed life. In preparation for this podcast, I re-examined all of the paintings that Leonardo ever produced, including those ones he didn't finish. So if you're curious as to what I think is the best piece of art Leonardo da Vinci ever made, I've made a free downloadable PDF available in the link in the podcast show notes where I talk about the piece and dissect it. But I've also included in that PDF a copy of the letter, the job application that I mentioned earlier that he wrote in full to Ludovico when first traveling to Milan. And as always, you'll also get a summary of all the learnings from this episode. And with that, I've been Justin Campbell Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.